Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really going deep, specifically into 18th century British aesthetics.
Hmm.
And we've pulled together this just fascinating array of ideas and thinkers, mainly from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on this. Really want to unpack these core debates about taste and beauty.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack there. You're right. It's a fascinating period for aesthetics. I mean, for a philosopher in the 18th century, it wasn't enough to just say, oh, that's beautiful. They wanted to go deeper. They wanted to understand, like, what actually is taste? Are there universal rules for beauty? How does our appreciation of a stunning vista, like a beautiful landscape, connect to, maybe admiring a well-crafted poem? These are really fundamental questions that they were grappling with.
Yeah, and speaking of fundamental questions, our source highlights that the real kind of central focus was this whole question of the nature of taste itself. And I think it's so interesting that Joseph Addison, early on, he kind of offered this compelling initial definition. He said that taste is that faculty, that thing that allows us to perceive beauty with pleasure and imperfection with dislike. It's almost like a sensory thing, a reaction of your soul.
Right, right. So you encounter something beautiful, you experience a positive feeling, you encounter some flaw and you feel a negative one.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think most people back then would have agreed with that basic description. But the real philosophical challenge was like, okay, we get that. We get that we respond to beauty, but how does that actually work? Is it like reasoning, like our
Yeah.
intellectual ability to understand concepts? Or is it more like our five senses, like a physical, reaction to what we see and hear and touch around us? That was the big question. And, that question really kind of fueled a lot of the aesthetic theory of the time.
And it's from that tension, that our source identifies three key, I guess you could call them schools of thought. And today we're going to be focusing on this first one, the internal sense theories. And it's this idea that we possess this inward eye or a mental sense that's specially attuned to perceiving beauty, much like our eyes perceive color, our ears perceive sound. But it's this other sense that's directed at this different realm of experience.
Yeah, and for a philosopher, I think what's really cool about this is that they drew this very direct analogy with, our regular sensory apparatus. Like they weren't just, pulling this faculty out of thin air. They were trying to ground this experience in, something that we can all understand, our senses. But of course, with aesthetics, it's applied to these non-physical objects and non-physical qualities.
Absolutely. And leading the charge on all these ideas, we have some real heavy hitters: Shaftesbury, Hutcheson, Hume, and Reid. So let's start. Let's start with Shaftesbury, who is writing in the early 18th century, most notably in the Moralists. And he comes up with this really key distinction between what he calls representative beauty and original beauty.
Ah, yes. And anyone who's read Plato is going to see the clear lineage here. Original beauty for Shaftesbury resides in the divine mind, that source of all order, harmony, perfection, all that good stuff. And so representative beauty then is the beauty that we see in the world around us, in art, in nature. It's like a reflection of that original divine beauty, but maybe like a faint reflection. It's like those shadows on the cave wall in Plato's allegory. They're hinting at this greater reality.
I like that, yeah. And Shaftesbury, he argues that we shouldn't just stop at appreciating this representative beauty, right? That's not enough. We should use that as a way to try to understand and really fully enjoy the original beauty. And he even connects this to, the type of pleasure we should seek, a more rational enjoyment, as opposed to these just purely, sensory or bodily pleasures. And he actually calls those interested, almost like a negative connotation.
Right. He's not really a fan of just, simple bodily pleasures. And the example that he gives is, contrasting like sexual pleasure versus contemplating the living architecture of the human form. It's really about where you're placing your focus. So for Shaftesbury, sexual pleasure is tied to this personal desire, like possession, so it's interesting. But appreciating the inherent design of the human form, the order, that's a more elevated, disinterested kind of pure engagement with beauty.
I see. And to clarify that even further, he uses this analogy of a coin. He argues that we only appreciate a coin's real beauty if we admire the design, the evidence that a mind was behind that. Not just the fact that it's worth something, like you can buy things with it. If we're just focused on the purchasing power, like what we can get with it, we're missing the whole aesthetic side. And this kind of leads him to this whole idea of three, what he calls three degrees or orders of beauty. I think is so interesting.
And his Neoplatonic roots are really showing. So first you've got what he calls the dead forms, right? These are objects that are shaped by human artifice, by people making things or by nature, but they don't have any inherent intelligence. They're just objects. Then you've got the forms which form, so those are beings that do have intelligence, that act like ourselves. And then finally, the peak, the third order of beauty is that which forms, even those forms which form. So it's the divine intellect, like the source of it all. It's a very hierarchical structure, which for a philosopher is a classic way of understanding the world, finding that first principle.
So it sounds like for Shaftesbury, beauty is ultimately grounded in the divine mind, right? So then it's not really subjective, It's not just a matter of taste. It has this kind of objective reality that exists, like outside of human perception.
Exactly, yeah. He'd argue it's beautiful from a cosmic standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And because beauty for him ultimately resides in the mind, or at least reflects mind. It's not something that we can just see with our eyes or hear with our ears.
Right.
So he proposes this mental or inward sense that perceives beauty.
Yeah.
And it's really important to remember that he's not saying that this is some weird, esoteric thing that only some people have. It's as natural and immediate as our external senses. The mind simply perceives harmony and order as naturally as our eyes see color. That's his idea.
Yeah, and he even cites all these figures from the Neoplatonic tradition, Augustine, Plotinus, to show that, this concept of having this inward faculty for perceiving beauty, it's not new. It's been around for a while. So, okay, let's move on now to Francis Hutcheson, who openly, says hey, Shaftesbury, I'm building off your ideas, so thanks for that.
Right. Hutcheson takes this idea of an internal sense and really runs with it. I mean, he agrees with a lot of what Shaftesbury said, like the immediacy, the necessity, the disinterested nature of pleasure. But, he starts to branch out a bit, particularly in his thinking about how internal this sense actually is, and even about what beauty is.
Right, because, Shaftesbury really focused on this idea that beauty ultimately comes from the mind, right? So because of that, he was very focused on this internal sense. But Hutcheson, he's not necessarily sold on that idea that all objects of beauty are inherently mental. He observes, that beauty comes from proportion, from order, what he calls uniformity amidst variety. And while that might originate from a mind, a designer, it doesn't mean that only minds can be beautiful. So Shaftesbury's looking, up towards this divine source, but Hutcheson's looking out at the structure of the world as well.
Yeah. And he makes a very compelling point about how, those 5 external senses, those just aren't enough. Someone could have perfect vision, perfect hearing, and still be totally blind to beauty. He even points out that we see beauty in things like mathematical theorems, universal truths. Those aren't material objects, right?
Yeah.
That points to some kind of internal cognitive power, at play.
But, and our source makes this really good point. Just because we can't fully explain beauty with just our 5 senses, it doesn't necessarily mean that the sense of beauty is completely internal the way Shaftesbury thought.
Right.
It just means it's not reducible to just those 5 senses. And actually, Hutcheson, he clarifies this idea of internal sense even more.
Yeah, he does. He writes this essay on the nature and conduct of the passions and affections. And in there, he explains that this internal sense, it doesn't just, happen immediately. These ideas about beauty, they arise only after certain other ideas have already been received and compared. It's a process. So perceiving beauty, it's not as direct as sensing light. It's dependent on us, first processing and comparing a bunch of, sensory and intellectual inputs to see that uniformity amidst variety. And he even later prefers to use terms like reflex or subsequent to highlight that dependency, as a separate move from that basic input.
So that refinement, that really changes how he sees beauty. Because Hutcheson, he doesn't go as far as Shaftesbury in grounding beauty in this divine mind, right? He's not as much of a realist when it comes to aesthetics. So he leans towards a form of idealism where, beauty is more what Locke would call secondary qualities, like color or taste. They exist in the mind of the person perceiving. And he even says, look, God could have designed us to, respond to irregularity, chaos, things like that, but he chose uniformity amidst variety. And for a philosopher, that's an interesting question. Okay, so then why would he do that? What are the implications of that kind of choice?
Right, exactly. And Hutcheson's answer to that is that the universe, it has order, And for us as humans, as finite beings, we learn best through these universal theorems, which are inherently, uniformity amidst variety.
Yeah.
So he's saying, look, God made it this way because it's good for us. Our love of order, that helps us understand the world. So it's not just that beauty is pleasurable, it's beneficial.
It's almost like a guide for our minds, to seek knowledge.
I like that. And what's interesting is while he's emphasizing this like intellectual side of beauty, he's not saying that material objects can't be beautiful, which, if you remember, is different from Shaftesbury. Our source actually says that Hutcheson's ideas kind of foreshadow some later ideas in aesthetics, like Frank Sibley.
Okay.
Okay, so let's move on to David Hume.
All right, so Hume, he takes this idea of taste as this internal sense from Hutcheson, but he stresses that it doesn't just work on its own. It needs other mental faculties to give it something to work with. And he makes this point about how, when you're appreciating the arts, the really complex arts, that often involves reasoning, it involves making distinctions, it involves comparisons. It's not just passively taking in sensations. And for Hume, as a philosopher who's really focused on how we know things, how we learn, this focus on these different mental faculties makes sense. Right. It's not just one sense doing one thing. It's this interplay of our minds. And unlike Hutcheson, who had his big idea of uniformity amidst variety, Hume, he's not really looking for one single principle, that explains beauty. He thinks that there are many different things that can contribute to how we judge beauty. And he even pushes back on Hutcheson's idea that aesthetic pleasure has to be, totally disinterested. He says, actually, sometimes an object's usefulness can make it more beautiful. As long as it's not like completely selfish usefulness.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like a well-designed chair, that's beautiful and it's useful. And like Hutcheson, Hume also sees beauty as being subjective. He puts it in the same category as those secondary qualities. But then he runs into this problem that always comes up with subjective views of beauty. Like if beauty is just in the eye of the beholder, how can we say that anyone's judgment is better or correct or whatever than anyone else's? And his solution to that is this really neat analogy to how we judge colors.
Oh, interesting. So, we all agree that color experience is subjective, right? But we still know that there are certain conditions that make a color judgment more valid. It has to be daylight. You can't be colorblind, things like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Hume says that there are conditions for making a good judgment of beauty too. And those conditions, they include things like having this delicacy of taste, which basically means you've had practice, you've seen a lot of art, all of nature, being able to make comparisons, being free of prejudice, things like that. And also understanding the object well enough so you can grasp what it's really about, and then the right sentiment will naturally arise, So for Hume, beauty is, yes, subjective, but there's this ideal of judgment that we can, try to get closer to.
I like that. So even though it's subjective, there's still a way to judge it, a better and a worse. Okay, so now let's talk about Thomas Reid.
Okay, so Reid is writing a little bit later than the others, and he pulls ideas from a lot of different places. But, when it comes to taste, he's definitely following in that internal sense tradition that, Hutcheson and Shaftesbury started. He really likes Hutcheson's idea that beauty is perceived by this reflex or secondary sense, meaning that you have to grasp the object in some other way first before you can judge its beauty.
Right. It's not just this immediate sense. You have to process it first.
Exactly. But, he does disagree with Hutcheson on what actually makes up this sense of beauty. See, Hutcheson really emphasizes that agreeable feeling, that's central for him. But Reid says, no, there has to be a cognitive judgment too. You have to actually say, this object has beauty. You have to assign that property to it. He thinks that Hutcheson's focus on, just feeling leads to this problem where, if beauty is just a feeling, then nothing's really beautiful, right? It's all in our heads. And he thinks that just doesn't match up with, our basic sense that some things really are beautiful,
It's like saying the sunset isn't beautiful, it's just that we feel like it is, and that doesn't seem quite right. So it sounds like he's defending realism when it comes to beauty.
Exactly, yeah. He appeals to common sense, to theological arguments, to the very nature of what makes things beautiful. He says that those feelings that we get when we experience beauty, the love, the admiration, those have to be directed at something that's actually good, like some kind of perfection or excellence that's in the object.
Okay, so what are those perfections for him? What makes something beautiful, objectively?
Well, he divides the perfections of the mind into three classes. First, there are the amiable moral virtues, then the admirable intellectual talents, and finally the perfections of active powers. And he says, look, these are objective. It's not just a matter of opinion. Just like we can't just say, oh, I think 2 + 3 = 15. We can't just decide to admire ignorance over knowledge. There's something real there, that we're responding to.
Okay, I see. So what about when he's talking about beauty in the material world in things.
Ah, well, he actually goes back to Shaftesbury's idea of, original versus representative beauty, though he usually says derives instead of representative. But the point is, he says the beauty that we see in, physical things, that's ultimately coming from the beauty of minds. Like material beauty is like a sign that points to something deeper, to, mental qualities. Like you see the wisdom in a natural design, the instincts in an animal, the character in a human form.
So even though he's saying that, material things aren't like fundamentally beautiful in the same way as minds, the beauty that we see in them isn't just made up. It's connected to these real mental perfections. And it almost sounds like he's getting at this idea of association, like how we associate certain physical things with mental qualities.
Yeah, he does hint at this transfer or communication of beauty from, mind to matter,
Hmm.
though he doesn't really develop that fully the way that, later associationist thinkers would.
Right. And this whole journey through these internal sense theories, it really shows how much these 18th century philosophers, they were just like wrestling with this idea of like, are our experiences subjective? Are there objective qualities? It's fascinating. And they really laid the groundwork for a lot of the stuff that we're still talking about today in aesthetics, like what is an aesthetic property? How do we perceive it?
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. And for you, our philosophical listener out there, I think there's some really key takeaways here. First, the 18th century, it was this really, this time of huge debate about aesthetic judgment. Is it about our senses? Is it about our minds? Internal sense theories, they came up with this idea of a separate faculty just for beauty, which raised a whole bunch of other questions. Like what are the objects of that faculty? Is it reliable? How does it work with our other mental powers?
Right. And like we've been talking about, Shaftesbury, Hutcheson, Hume, Reed, they all had their own spins on this internal sense.
Yeah.
And that constant back and forth between whether beauty is subjective or objective, that was a huge theme. As well as this like really complex question of, okay, we see beauty in the world, but is that just a reflection of some like deeper mental or even divine beauty?
Right, right. And these weren't just like abstract questions for them. These ideas really affected how people understood and appreciated art, nature, even morality. Like that whole idea of disinterested aesthetic appreciation, that's had a huge impact on how we think about art today.
Totally. So to leave you with a question to ponder, if we take all of these ideas about this internal sense seriously,
Mhm.
how would a philosopher today approach this feeling that we get when we experience beauty? Is it a separate sense, or is it better explained by emotion or cognition or even, maybe our culture? And does this old debate about the cognitive and sensory aspects of taste, does that still have something to teach us today? It's a question worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.